This is actually Jennifer Morgan, and I'm the Government Documents Librarian at the Jerome Hall Law Library at IU, Maurer School of Law. And thank you for attending today's webinar, which, as Kara said, is co-sponsored by Indigo and the Indiana State Library. And I'm a member of Indigo, and we're a special interest group for government information professionals who are dedicated to issues concerning government documents and access to federal and state information. Indigo members meet twice a year for networking, and we have educational programming, and we are always looking for new members. So Kim and I are happy to present our two-part webinar series, Research in the Law, Finding Cases and Judicial Documents. Today's part, an introduction to court structure and finding case law, will be given by my colleague, Kimberly Mattioli. And Kim is our Student Services Librarian at the Jerome Hall Law Library at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law in Bloomington. Now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Kim.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the webinar today. So here is a brief overview of what we're going to learn today. So I'm going to start by giving you kind of a basic reminder of our system of government and the types of primary sources of law that each branch of our government produces. I'll then go into an overview of how our court systems are structured, both on the federal level and on the state level. Then we'll talk about the idea of precedent in our court system and how case law helps shape the law in our country. We'll go into the anatomy of a case opinion, how they're written by judges, and then a really brief overview of the publication of cases and the sources in which you can find them. And then finally, at the end, I'll show you some free resources for finding case law, as well as one source that is not actually free, but that is widely available for public use at many different academic libraries. So a good way to talk about the three branches of government is by talking about the different types of primary sources of law. So I put 4 different primary sources of law up on the slide. We have constitutions, statutes, regulations, and cases. As you probably can remember from like grade school civics classes, there are 3 branches of the federal government and also of all the different state governments. So you have the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The branches all function in tandem and engage in a system of checks and balances. Each branch of government, all 3 of them, have their own lawmaking power, and while in reality it's probably a bit more complex than this, in general, each branch of government is responsible for producing its own source of primary law. So first you have the legislative branch, which produces statutes. At the federal level, these statutes are codified into the United States Code, or the USC, and then at the state level, the names vary. But for example, in Indiana, the statutes are codified into the Indiana Code. Next, we have the executive branch, which has many different administrative agencies as part of it. So administrative agencies have rule-making power, and they promulgate rules, which are also known as regulations. These regulations have the same legal effect as a statute. Examples of federal agencies include like the Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, et cetera, et cetera. And states will often have equivalent state administrative agencies. So federal regulations are codified into the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. And again, names really vary on the state level. So Indiana's is called the Indiana Administrative Code. And then finally, the third branch is the judicial branch, and that's what we're focusing on today. The judicial branch produces case opinions. So sometimes you'll hear about areas of law that are referred to as common law. This means that the majority of the law in that area comes from cases, and that's as opposed to statutory law, where the majority of the law comes from statutes. I'm sorry, Jennifer just told me that having a hard time hearing me. Hopefully this is a little bit better. So just go ahead and use the chat feature if you can't hear me, and Jennifer will flag me down. She's sitting across the table from me. So I will go into more detail today about how cases are produced on both the state and the federal level and how they're published. Jennifer's giving me the thumbs up, so hopefully everyone can hear me now. Finally, a fourth type of primary source that I put on here are constitutions. They don't necessarily fit neatly into one of the three branches of government that I discussed, but they're a very important primary source, so I wanted to mention them, especially because a lot of really important case opinions come from constitutions. Okay, so let's talk about court structure, because you need a really clear understanding of how things are organized before you're able to fully understand how you can research cases. The first and most important thing to be aware of when you need to do any sort of case law research is that there are two main court systems in this country, and they operate independently from one another. So there is the federal court system, and then there are state court systems of all the different states. So if someone has a legal issue that comes up in Bloomington, Indiana, that does not necessarily mean that the issue is going to be brought to an Indiana court. It might be, but it totally depends on whether the legal issue is state or federal. The federal system and the systems of almost all of the 50 states follow the same basic structure that I've pictured on this slide. So I've made it horizontal here, but it's perhaps even better to think of it vertically, with an arrow kind of going up. So the lowest courts in all the systems are the trial courts. So these are the courts you think of when you think of courts that you've seen on TV or read about in books, like in courtroom dramas. So there's a judge, there's often a jury, though there's not always a jury. There are two lawyers that are arguing with each other, making opening and closing statements, making objections to the judge, and all of those things. So these courts hear both criminal and civil cases. Criminal cases are when the government is charging someone with a crime, and then civil cases are when two people or two entities of some sort are suing each other for money. So trial courts hear both of those types. Then you have the middle courts, which are the intermediate appellate courts. So if a person loses their case at the trial court, they can often appeal to an intermediate appellate court. And lawyers in these types of cases, there's not a lot of arguing back and forth or an adversarial trial like there is on the trial level. It's more that they file appellate briefs with the court, explaining their arguments as to whether or not the lower court's decision should be overturned or whether it should be affirmed. And then panels of judges will decide the case. And then you finally have the highest courts, which you'll either see referred to as a final appeals court, or probably more often you'll see it as the court of last resort. And so these courts are made up of justices who will have the final say in a case by deciding whether cases decided at the intermediate appellate level should or should not be overturned. So I want to start by talking about federal trial courts, and then we'll talk about state courts in a little bit. But the federal system is a little bit easier to kind of understand, and then many state court systems follow the same general model, so it's a good starting place. So we'll start with the lowest courts, the trial courts, and on the federal level, they are called the United States District Courts. So if a person is going to file a suit that involves a federal law, they're going to start in one of the U.S. District Courts. And again, these courts hear both civil and criminal cases. There are 94 total U.S. district courts. Every state has at least one, and some states have up to 4. It really just depends on the caseload and seems to generally go with how populous a state is. So like New York and California have 4, a state like Alaska has 1. In Indiana, there are 2 different federal district courts. So their formal names for these are the United States District Court for the Northern District of Indiana, and then the United States District Court for the Southern District of Indiana. So the map here on this slide shows the counties that are in the Southern District of Indiana. And then within each district, there are also several different locations for the courts, and judges at those locations will hear cases from their specific division. So just to stay with our example of the Southern District of Indiana, it consists of 4 different divisions and 4 different courts. So Indianapolis, Terre Haute, Evansville, and New Albany. So the middle level of courts on the federal level are called circuit courts. So there are 13 circuits total 11 numbered regional districts, and then there's also the DC Circuit, which covers appeals from the DC District Court. And then finally, there's the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, which is really a pretty different thing than the other 12 because it hears cases based on subject matter rather than on geography. So for example, it has jurisdiction over like patent appeals. The other ones hear appeals from the district within their specific region. So for example, if you wanted to appeal a decision from one of the district courts in Indiana, your appeal would go to the 7th Circuit. And the 7th Circuit also includes district courts in Illinois and Wisconsin. So as I mentioned before, rather than having an adversarial trial like you would on the trial court level, the circuit courts function much differently. So lawyers on both sides will file briefs explaining how the law fits their argument, and then they will conduct oral arguments in front of a panel of 3 different judges. And then those judges decide the case. They'll say whether the trial court decision is upheld, whether they're overturning it, or whether they're sending the case back to be tried again, and that's called being remanded. That's something you might see in a case opinion. The circuit courts on the federal level are just incredibly important, even though they're only intermediate courts. And this is due to the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States only hears about 2% of the cases that are actually filed with it each year. So effectively, unless there's like a really important legal issue that has national constitutional importance, the circuit court judges are going to be the ones that have the final say in the law. Some circuit courts are considered more prestigious than others. So for example, the DC Circuit has the United States Congress and also most administrative agencies within its jurisdiction, so it's considered to be highly prestigious. I think at least 4 current Supreme Court justices came to the court from the DC Circuit. The Second Circuit is also known to be fairly prestigious. It has New York. The Ninth Circuit, I think, is mainly just known for being enormous and kind of unwieldy, so that's what the Ninth Circuit is known for. So a lot of them have, sort of different things that they're known for. And then finally, we have the Federal Final Appeals Court, or the Court of Last Resort, and that is the Supreme Court. So the court consists of 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices, and they all have lifetime tenure. People who want to appeal a case from a federal circuit, also from a state Supreme Court, as long as the legal issue involves a federal constitutional issue, they have to file something called a writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court. As I mentioned before, the court only accepts a very, very small fraction of appeals that are filed, so about 100 to 150 cases per year. So cases that are not accepted will be labeled as cert denied. So if you see that on a case, that just means that they filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court decided not to hear it. And then in that case, the circuit court's opinion is the one that will become the law. So the Supreme Court decisions, they're the final say in legal disputes. Sometimes the Supreme Court does end up reversing its own decisions years down the line, but that's kind of infrequent enough that you can assume that the decisions rendered are going to remain the law of the land. Okay, so that's the federal level. Now let's talk a bit about state courts. So while some things do differ from state to state, in general, state courts follow the same hierarchy. So trial court, then intermediate appellate court, and court of last resort. So I've put the Indiana court structure from the Indiana Judiciary website on the slide here. And then you can also follow this link to the Court Statistics Project, which has the structures of all of the different state courts. So I'm going to attempt to go over to show you a live demo here. Jennifer's nodding, it looks like it's working. So this is a website called the Court Statistics Project, which apparently I have a very hard time saying. But you can go to this map right here and you can click on whatever state you're interested in. So I'm going to go to Indiana. And it gives you some pretty detailed hierarchical charts here. So you can look down here to see the legend. It has like a thin blue line around trial court ones, and then a thick blue line against appellate level courts. I probably would have done different colors because I think that it's kind of hard to see the difference, but nobody asked me. So these are the main trial courts in Indiana. So you can see that the terminology can get a bit tricky. So you have circuit courts on the same level as superior courts, and they're kind of the same thing. And then you also have probate courts. So my best advice is, if you are looking at a state court structure and you don't understand why it's structured the way it is or why things are called the way that they are, you can normally just kind of Google it and find an explanation from an official government website. Like Indiana does have an explanation of why they have two different trial courts called circuit courts and superior courts, so you could look it up that way. And then it'll show you, we have the Court of Appeals, there's also the tax court, and then it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. So you can follow the arrows to see which types of cases are appealed to which courts. So I'm going to go back to the map here because I want to show you another example of just how confusing these things can be on the state level. So if you click into New York, you'll see that the trial court levels in New York are called Supreme Courts. And then the highest court, the court of last resort, is called the Court of Appeals. So it's like they're trying to be difficult in New York and just confuse everybody. This is like a very common thing that law students get confused about when they first started law school. So if you're doing case law research, my best advice is to always make sure that you understand the state's court structure before you get into doing any sort of real research. For one, it'll save you a lot of confusion, and then I'll also get into the reason why it's so important on the next slide. And then, even though it is confusing, you can always find court structures of states and then the terminology of its courts online for free. Okay, so now that I've spent all this time explaining to you the court structures of the federal and state systems, I'm going to try to explain to you why it's so important to understand. So understanding the hierarchy of the court system and the difference between the different court systems is essential because of the issues of precedent and stare decisis. So legal precedent is defined as an established principle or rule. So when a judge issues an opinion, they produce a case, and that case comes to a conclusion about the law. So the judge is saying, this is what the law is, and this is how we're going to apply the law to these types of facts under these circumstances. So that case, once it's been issued, has established a precedent. So stare decisis, that means literally to stand by things decided. And what the principle means in short is that courts must abide by established precedents. They can't just say like, no, we don't agree with that. We're going to come up with our own idea. So there are two types of precedent that you have to be aware of when you're doing case law research. There's binding or mandatory precedent, and then there's persuasive precedent. So let's start with binding. As you may have guessed, binding precedent are principles or rules that courts are required to follow. So there are kind of two factors in determining whether a case has binding precedent over any particular court. So there's jurisdiction, and then there's hierarchy. The jurisdiction factor comes down to what we were talking about earlier with the different court systems. So every state has a different court system. So state courts in Indiana do not have to follow precedent from state courts in Ohio, for example. So they can decide the same legal issue in completely opposite ways if they want to, and that is fine. Even courts in the same jurisdiction, however, also have to consider the hierarchy question when they're looking at precedent. So binding precedent only comes from courts that are higher than the court that is hearing a case. So an example from the federal system is a court in the Seventh Circuit that is hearing like a novel issue of law is only required to follow precedent from like the US Supreme Court and from its own previous decisions. So this is true even if the Sixth Circuit has already heard a case on that exact same issue and rendered a decision. Since the Sixth and Seventh Circuits are on the same level in the hierarchy, their decisions are not binding on each other. So then once the Seventh Circuit renders a decision, that decision will be binding on the federal district courts that are within the Seventh Circuit because they're in the same jurisdiction and are lower on the hierarchy. So just to try to review that because the concept can be a little tricky. Binding precedent on a specific court is only for cases from the same jurisdiction and from courts that are higher in the court hierarchy. And I guess I should mention that U.S. Supreme Court cases, that's binding precedent for every court, no matter what. So the other type of precedent is persuasive precedent. And that can be cases from other jurisdictions or from courts of the same level. And this happens all the time, that courts hearing an issue for the first time will look to see how other courts have decided the same issue. So while the cases that they're looking to are not binding, they can still be very helpful because, I mean, I don't think most judges want to create wildly different laws from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So they can use persuasive precedent to try to help them figure out what they should do. So you have to be aware of these issues when you're doing case law research. So if you're looking for what the law is on a specific topic in Indiana, you need to be aware that you have to find Indiana cases, and you need to be aware of like what court the Indiana case you're looking at comes from, so that you know whether that is actually the law in the place where you're researching. So it's a little complicated, but also probably the most important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about how case law is developed. Okay. So now that we've talked about court structure and we've talked about precedents, it's time to finally talk about what you will see when you are reading a court opinion. So one thing I do want to point out when you're doing case law research is that you'll be reading cases from intermediate appellate courts and then courts of last resort. You're not going to see anything from trial courts, really. So they don't produce judicial opinions, and they also don't have precedential value anyway, so they're not reported. But you will be reading cases that look like this from the slide from both intermediate courts and from the highest courts. So I've put the first page of a U.S. Supreme Court case here so that you can see just an example. So at the very top, you'll see the official citation of the case. So the first number is the volume number of the reporter, and then you'll have an abbreviation for the name of the reporter, and I'll talk more about reporters in a moment. But in this case, the U.S. stands for U.S. reports for Supreme Court cases. This is the official reporter. There are other reporters, so you might see things abbreviated a little differently, depending on whether you're looking at an official version or not. But then the last number you'll have is the page number. Here, it still happens to just be forthcoming because these things are not exactly published quickly. So they'll add in the page number later, and then you'll have the year that the case was decided. So you'll also have a docket number, and part 2 of this webinar, which takes place a week from today, will discuss how to look up dockets for cases. So I won't get into it too much because I don't want to steal Jennifer's thunder, but dockets will allow you to locate a lot of different documents that are generated throughout the lifetime of a case. So they're very useful, and that's all I'll say for now, but you can find docket numbers from within case opinions. Then you'll come to some basic information, like you have the name of the case, you have the date the case was decided, and then finally you'll come to the actual text of the opinion. So the judge or justice who wrote the majority opinion, which is the first opinion that you'll come to in a case, that person will be named up at the top. So in this case, it's Justice Kagan. And then you will have the text of the majority opinion. So that will give a background of the facts of the case. It will give the court's final decision along with whatever legal reasoning they had. It'll give citation to cases that they relied on to influence the opinion, etc. So other justices can sign on to an opinion. So like if they agree with the majority opinion, they'll sign their name to it. So to put it mildly, reading cases is not a super fun time, and they're very long and they're complicated and they're dense, but it is the kind of what you have to do to get to the legal rule on whatever issue was being decided. So it's just kind of what you have to put up with if you need to do any sort of legal research. So after the majority opinion, some cases are also going to include other opinions. They're not pictured here. We'll look at them in a little while. There can be concurring opinions. So those will be written by other judges or justices who did not write the majority opinion. And the situation with concurring opinions is often that a judge agrees with the ruling, but not with the reasoning. And so they want to write and make their opinion clear on, like, yes, I agree with the outcome of this case, but whoever wrote the majority opinion was wrong about this, and here's why. And then there are also dissenting opinions, and those are written by judges or justices who just completely disagree with the ruling. So sometimes, actually, dissenting opinions can be just as interesting to read, or even more so than a majority opinion, especially at the Supreme Court level where things can get really contentious. But obviously that's not where you're going to be relying on anything that they say for a legal ruling. It's just might be more interesting for other reasons. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about the publication of cases, mainly so that you can understand like what the citations are when you look at a case. So as I mentioned on the last slide, it's just cases from intermediate appellate courts and then courts of last resort. Those are the ones that are going to be published into reporters, and it's not every case. It's just going to be ones that have precedential value, so ones that say something new or have novel facts or something like that. Supreme Court cases are going to be published in the U.S. reports, and then lower federal courts, so circuit courts, those cases are going to be published in the Federal Reporter and the Federal Supplement. So you'll see those abbreviated as either just F or FSUP. And then state cases, finally, those are published in a variety of regional reporters. So I think that there are like 7 or 9 of them total. I put a few examples here. So there's like Pacific Reporter, Southern Reporter, and then certain states they're just all sorted into one of the reporters. So Indiana is in the Northeastern Reporter. Okay, so that was my very long introduction to what you need to know before you can even get started on case law research. And so now I want to get into where you would go to actually find some cases. So there are some areas of law where many sources are readily, freely available, and you can find them in a lot of different places. Unfortunately, case law is not necessarily one that you would think of as being a very good thing to research on freely available sources. However, there are plenty of places where you can locate court opinions for free, and also some of the free sources have been getting pretty good recently. So let's start. I'm going to switch back over to show you some live demos here. Let's start by looking at the Supreme Court of the United States website. So it's supremecourt.gov. So the website has cases from 1991 to 2012 in bound volumes. It sounds really weird to say that something online is in a bound volume, but they have basically just scanned the bound volume from paper and put it online. And then they also have what are called slip opinions. So slip opinions are the first printing of a case. It's like a little pamphlet print, and that's what they have before they're bound into bigger volumes. So they have those from 2012 up until the present. So you can easily find opinions from the Supreme Court website. If you go over here on the left, you can go to opinions and then go down to opinions of the court. So Supreme Court terms go from October to June. So when you see the year, it says term year 2019. That means for the term starting in October 2019 and then ending in June of 2020. So there actually aren't that many yet, just a few. So let's go into term year 2018 so you can see what a full year of Supreme Court cases looks like. Scroll down. Most cases are handed down in June. They kind of do like a dumping thing at the end of their term. So you'll see the most Supreme Court cases here at the end. And I'm going to click on this case right here, Rucho v. Common Cause. So this is a case that was decided last year, and it's about partisan gerrymandering. So when you click on it, it brings up a nice PDF of this slip opinion. And the first thing you'll see is the syllabus. And the thing you need to know about the syllabus is that it's not actually a part of the case. It's just kind of a description of what happens in the case and then a background of the legal issue. So it says at the top here in these tiny letters that it's done for the convenience of the reader. So I think supposedly it's easier to parse than perhaps reading through the entire long opinion. So you have to scroll down to get to the actual opinion. So I'm just going to kind of quickly scroll down to, you'll see it, it's pretty obvious right here. This is where the opinion starts. So this case is interesting because it actually includes two different cases that were brought together because it involved the same legal issue. So there are two different docket numbers and like two different lower courts and all of that. So if you scroll through, you can see that the cases get very, very, very lengthy. And they'll be right after the majority opinion, that's when you'd come to like concurring opinions and the dissenting opinions. So as I mentioned before, not always an easy task to read through cases, but that's just kind of how they are. So I'm going to X out of here and show you how to find earlier ones. So you can either go to where it says see earlier opinions or go up here to the left where it says bound volumes. So I'm going to click there. And the main difference that you should be aware of is that here you can't just click into the individual case. So you actually have to, probably the best way would be to know the citation so that you can find the correct volume number. And then all of the cases are bound together just like they would be in print if you came into a law library and looked at the reporter that way. So I'm scrolling down past all of the introductory material here to show you that it will give you in alphabetical order all of the cases that are recorded in this one particular bound volume. So if you only have the name of a case, it can be a little tricky because you need the citation to figure out which volume you need to look in. And the website has this thing called Case Citation Finder, where supposedly you can type in the name and then it will give you the volume. I tested it a little bit and honestly, I just didn't really think that it worked all that well. Like I tested it with cases where I knew what volume they were in, typed them in, and it did not bring up the right volume. So it might be something that you have to kind of like Google around to find the actual case citation and then come and look through the volumes that way. So, excuse me. They do have transcripts of oral arguments, which again, Jennifer, I keep plugging Jennifer's webinar next week. She will be talking about oral arguments next week, so I won't mention that too much now. They also have dockets. And they do have an advanced search feature up here at the upper right. So I'm going to click there. And you can choose to search just by opinions. You can also search through bound volumes. So I'm going to do a search for what we were just talking about with the Rucho case, partisan gerrymandering. Do a search, and it says no items found. So I don't actually know why that happened, because when I tested this yesterday, it found all of the cases. So this is apparently just a risk that you take when you're doing live demonstrations, is that sometimes it does not work. I was actually going to say that it was a pretty good search feature. I think I spelled it correctly too. So I don't know.
Take out partisan.
Let's take out partisan on Jennifer's recommendation here and see if we can just do gerrymandering. No. Well, I do assure you that it worked yesterday. So I'm assuming that there's just like a problem with the search functionality right now. Because yesterday it brought up all the cases that I knew about recently that dealt with partisan gerrymandering. So, well, there you have that. So you can also find selected like lower federal court cases on their official websites. And again, like coverage, like what years are covered will just kind of depend, and the usefulness of the search feature will vary just depending on the court. So that's always an option, is to go to the court's website. So now let's talk about official state judiciary websites. So I'm going to start with Indiana as an example. So the link that I've put here in the PowerPoint will take us to the official website for the Indiana Supreme Court. So I'm going to go back over to the web here. So it's in.gov/judiciary/supreme. And with any sort of government website, they're all going to be different, obviously. So you just kind of have to look around to see if you can find what it is that you're looking for. And so in our case, there's a link right here that says opinions and orders. So that's fairly easy. Sometimes you have to click through a lot of things and things are kind of hidden. But here, the Indiana website is fairly easy. So this will take us to appellate decisions from the Indiana Supreme Court, the Indiana Court of Appeals, and then the Indiana Tax Court. So if you click into recent opinions for the Indiana Supreme Court, they must archive things very quickly because there's only one recent case listed and it's from the 31st of January. So let's go ahead and click into that. So the case looks different than it does like from the official Supreme Court, and also this will look different if it's published into an official reporter, like the Northeastern Reporter. But this is what it looks like on the state level when they first publish it. And even though it looks different, everything is, basically the same elements. So you have the docket number up here, the names of the parties, the dates that it was argued, the dates that it was decided. It tells you which court it was appealed from, and then it gives you the docket number. This long, confusing looking number here is the docket number for the lower state court. And then it will tell you who gave the opinion, who concurred, and who dissented. So here is the text of the opinion. It looks like this is kind of an intro, and then it gives you the factual history so you can see what happened in the case. That'll give you the facts of the case. And then if you keep scrolling down, you'll eventually get to like the discussion and then the decision. So at least this case on the Indiana level was much easier to kind of parse through than the ones on the Supreme Court level. I can't guarantee that all Indiana cases will be easy, but this one looks like it's a little bit shorter at least. So let's go back so that I can show you how to find other cases. So if you click into where it says archived opinions, this will take you to cases from June of 2005 up until, just recent. So it will give you the case name, the date the case was published, and then over to the right, you'll have the docket numbers from the lowest court and then from the appellate court. So you'd be able to look up information about the lower court cases from there. And clicking into these, it will bring you to the same type of PDF that we saw when I showed you from the recent cases. If you want to find much older cases, you have to click this link above the boxes here that says visit the previous opinions archive. So if you click on that, the website is not great, but over here on the right, you'll see Judicial Opinions Archive, and then again, you have the choice of doing Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and Indiana Tax Court. So if you click on the Supreme Court of Indiana, this will bring you to cases that I looked it up for you. It goes from January of 1999 through June of 2005. So anything older than 1999 is not going to be archived on the judiciary's website. And these are also not in PDF format, they're in HTML format, but you can still read through them fairly easily. The only other format they have is in WordPerfect, and so that kind of made me laugh a little because I don't think anyone probably has WordPerfect anymore, but if you do, you could look at the original version through that format. And then you would just take the same steps to look at cases from the Indiana Court of Appeals and from the Indiana Tax Court. So I'm going to go back to the main page here for the Indiana Judiciary. So if you click on search cases, this actually takes you to a docket search, which is not what we're trying to talk about today. That's what you'll talk about next week with Jennifer. So instead, I tried to do a search from up here where it just says search courts.in.gov. And I tried to do a search for partisan gerrymandering to keep with the same example, but it did not actually bring up any cases. So I think that it brought up other stuff. Although now this isn't working either. So I think I'm having it, there we go. So it brought up, things from different codes. So there might be some relevant information in there, but I didn't actually see any cases on partisan gerrymandering in Indiana. But you could I looked up something else to see if I could find cases that way, and it did actually work. So I typed in spite fence, mainly just because it's kind of a funny concept. It's when people sue each other for putting up fences out of spite. So this did bring up cases, and you can tell from the little blurb at the bottom here that it does actually talk about spite fences. So not probably the best search functionality that you would want to use when you're searching for cases, but it does at least work somewhat. So if you know you're looking for something from Indiana, you could always go there. Okay, So that's kind of how you find cases from the Indiana official government website. You can find cases from other state websites basically doing the same thing. You can, try to Google and find the official court website if you want to, or you could use this website that was put together by the National Center for State Courts. So I'm going to go over and show you what it looks like. This is a website that has brought together all of the official websites from all the different state judiciaries. So I like going here mainly because it saves me the trouble of trying to hunt down what an official court is called in a particular jurisdiction. Like, it just saves you the trouble of having to kind of sort through your Google searches. So you can go here and then know that you are going to make it to the right place. And so, you can go to like Massachusetts or whatever, find the Supreme Court, and then kind of hunt through the website the same way that I just showed you on the Indiana one. Okay. So I'm sure that you noticed that while those websites may be good for tracking down cases that you already have a citation to, they may not be overly useful if you're trying to find cases on a particular topic, especially if you don't yet know what those cases are or what jurisdiction you want to look in. And so if you are doing case law research kind of from scratch, the free source that I would recommend is Google Scholar. There are some others. There's something called Find Law, and then there's something called Justia. But Google Scholar is so much better that I'm actually not even going to bother showing you the other ones because you should just immediately go to Google Scholar for that. So it has both state and federal cases. So you can search for cases from multiple jurisdictions as opposed to what I just showed you on the Indiana website, which only searches Indiana cases. I've put the dates from the different jurisdictions here on the slide. So Supreme Court from 1791 to present, federal circuit courts from 1923 to present, and then state cases from 1950 to present. So let's go to Google Scholar. So it's just scholar.google.com, and it automatically takes you to articles. So you need to go over here and click on case law. And it automatically brings up the option to either choose federal courts or, of course, Google knows exactly where we all are at any given time, so it knows that we might want to search Indiana courts. You can also go to the select courts link right here, and then it will show you all of the state courts that you can choose from on the left and all the federal courts that you can choose from on the right. So this is also just a great way to visualize how the courts systems are structured. So, you can look at the state and see that you can look for Court of Appeals or Supreme Court from Arizona, and then you can go to the 7th Circuit and see all of the different districts from the different states that are within the 7th Circuit. So it's a nice visualization. I'm actually going to go back, though, and leave the jurisdiction blank and just do a pretty basic search for partisan gerrymandering. So this brings back a lot of cases. It brings back about 1,200. You can narrow them by using the filters on the left. So you could just do federal courts if you wanted, or just do Indiana courts. You could also narrow by time to just find recent ones, like if you are looking for something that you know is very recent. It automatically sorts it by relevance. You can also sort it by date, though I tend not to do that because all it does is bring you back things that are super recent that might not be the most relevant to you. So I'm just going to scroll down and choose this case right here, Gill v. Whitford, to show you how to look at cases on Google Scholar. So this is another Supreme Court case, this one from 2018. And on Google Scholar, it does still include the syllabus, so you can just read that to kind of get a summary of what happens in the case if you want to. If you scroll down past the syllabus, you can start to see how ridiculously complicated some of the signing on to different opinions is. Like, some people have signed on only for parts 1 and 2, but not 3. You can concur in part, concur in the judgment, but dissent in other parts. So it can get a little much, but this is, how you would figure out who signed on to what part. And then you'll get to the text of the opinion. So Google Scholar has a really good feature that I want to make you aware of. And and it's this button up here at the top left called How Cited. So over here on the right, you'll see that this says cited by. So this is showing you all the cases that have cited Gill v. Whitford. And so you can see that here's our Rucho case that the Supreme Court decided in 2019. And so those are cases that you might want to read because they're going to be more recent than the one that you were just looking at that have cited the one you're looking at, and it might further expand on the law in some way. You can also look at the related documents here on the right, which will give you basically just similar cases that deal with similar issues you might want to look at. And then over here on the left, there is the how this document has been cited. So this is like the main thing that you'll see. And this is helpful because it will show you what parts of the Gill case have been heavily cited in other opinions. So you can see that this case, MS v. Brown, and then 19 other citations cited like this one part of Gill. So it'll just kind of help you figure out what parts of the opinion are the really important ones. Okay, so that's Google Scholar. It's a great place to kind of start if you're doing free case law research. So we don't have much time left, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Nexus Uni, mainly because not everyone's going to have access to it, but I do want to mention it. It's a public access database that's made available by Lexis. It's not freely available, but a lot of academic libraries have purchased it and allow the public to use it. So like here at the IU Bloomington campus, you can come into one of the public access computers on like in our library and log into Nexus Uni and use it for research. I looked, and IU McKinney School of Law has access as well. I'm sure many other academic libraries in the state provide access. And it provides access to case law and many other types of law as well. So I'm just going to show you really quickly. I do want to leave time for questions at the end, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But you can search it. You can go down here and click what are you interested in. You can click on cases. You can choose either federal or state cases, and then you can do your search, partisan gerrymandering, type search. And then this brings back a lot of different cases, but I'm seeing some familiar names here. Here's Gill v. Whitford, and here's our Rucho case. So I'm just going to click in there to show you the two main reasons why I think if you can get access to Nexus Uni in a library, you should. So the first thing that's really great is that it has something called head notes. And so a head note is basically going to pull out the important aspects of a case for you. It's a nice shortcut, basically. So it will show you what the main points of law are from this case. And then, as we've discussed, reading cases is difficult and time-consuming. So you could kind of scroll through the head notes and see what the takeaway was from this case. It can just save you a lot of time. The other thing that it has is over here on the right called Shepherds. And this is a feature that does many different things, but one really important thing it does is that it tells you whether the case you're looking at has been overruled or whether it's still good law. So Google Scholar does not do this. What you'd have to do is look at the cases that cited your case and see if it overturned your case. So you have to kind of figure it out for yourself. Whereas here, it will tell you, if it had been overturned, there'd be a giant red stop sign right here. So you would know that it was something that you should not rely on in your case law research. Okay, so that is what I wanted to mention in terms of, court structure, precedent, and how to find cases online for free or through an academic library through Nexus Uni. Part 2 of our webinar series is next Thursday, February 13th at 10 o'clock. And my colleague Jennifer Morgan will be giving this part of the webinar. It's called An Introduction to Judicial Dockets, Oral Arguments, and Court Records and Briefs. So it's a pretty logical next step to the one that I just did. I showed you how to find cases, and now Jennifer next week will be showing you how to find all the things that go along with cases. So these are all other judicial branch documents. Okay, so I managed to leave about, I think, 8 minutes for questions. I also wanted to put my email address up there in case we don't get to a question that you have today. You can feel free to email me anytime, and I'm happy to answer questions. Here's our reference desk phone number and the link to our Ask a Librarian email service. And then I also put a link to our law library's research guides, because we have lots of really helpful research guides, including ones on finding free and low-cost sources. So now I'm going to go back over and try to look at the chat here. Let's see if I can figure out. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see if there are any questions. Okay. Happy to take questions if there are any.
Jane wants to know where she can go for more in-depth information on judicial branch resources.
Okay, let's see my question coming in. Sorry to sit here in awkward silence. I'm waiting for a question to come in. Someone's typing right now. Did the yellow triangle in the shepherd's part of Nexus Uni indicate caution? Yes, that's exactly what that indicates. So I can actually go back and see. It should tell you what the caution is. So when this says distinguished by, so if there's a caution, if there's a yellow signal, that means, you can still rely on the case, but there is some reason that another court has disagreed with this particular ruling on like maybe a very small issue or something like that. So in this case, a court from the Northern District of Florida has somehow said that their facts were different and that they might not have to rely on the case entirely. It would be something like that. So you should pay attention to it, but it's usually not like a deal breaker. You're welcome. Okay. Likewise, a red octagon and a green circle also have meaning, correct? Yes, so the red one means bad. The green one, it's usually like a plus sign, and it means that these are cases that have followed this particular case. So if you wanted to find like other cases that were also establishing like the same type of precedent, then you could click on the positive button and then find other cases that way. So yes. Jennifer just put a link in the chat to uscourts.gov, which gives, she says, a lot of great educational resources. You can learn all about the courts. We have someone else.
Thank you for doing this for us, Kim.
Oh, you're welcome. Just waiting to see if there's one more question here. It looks like someone, okay. I know this varies by state, but how do you direct patrons who are looking for cases from state trial courts? I generally direct them to the courts themselves. So yeah, you could go to the courts, like the court website, or actually call the court, like the clerk. It's often going to be that they're looking for dockets rather than like a case opinion like what we were talking about today. So Jennifer will discuss that a little bit next week, like to find trial court documents
Also,
from the docket sheet.
a lot of times patrons want transcripts, which are not in the docket, and they have to contact the court and pay a lot of money.
Yeah, so Jennifer is just saying that a lot of times patrons want transcripts of trials, and that is not included in the docket sheet, and so they have to call the court and actually pay for it, which is unfortunate. You're welcome. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you for letting me give this webinar. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to email me at any time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending today.